Hey guys, I'm with Tom Rylatt, who is a candidate in the 2025 elections. And today we are going to be talking to him about some of his opinions, his manifesto, and we're going to be going through some of the criticisms that I have thrown at future Guernsey in the past couple of weeks. Okay, hi, I am here with Tom. Tom, can you tell me who you are and what your background is?
My name's firstly, thank you for having me, Daisy. My name's Tom Rylatt. I'm one of the candidates in the Guernsey 2025 election. I'm standing with Forward Guernsey, which is a new political party this term. So I'm 25 years old. I grew up in Guernsey. I studied at St Sampson's High School, was head boy there in my last year. Did A levels at the grammar school, went to Sussex, got a law degree, enjoyed Brighton for a few years, which you're doing now. And then I don't come from a particularly well-off family. So because I got a scholarship from Lincoln's Inn, I was then able to train as a barrister in Manchester. And after that, I did some work in the county courts, so having my own clients, being in the courts, and then I was legal assistant to a leading London barrister. And then I realised that I couldn't really help people in law in the way I thought I might be able to. It's sort of one client in, one client out. You don't really get the sense of ownership over the work that you expect that you do. So law wasn't for me right now. So I came back from Manchester, came home to Guernsey with my girlfriend Chloe, and then the election came about at quite a good time.
So you're quite a young candidate, aren't you? You're 25?
Yes, yeah.
Can you talk to me about firstly being a young candidate, because that must be an interesting experience given that nobody in the assembly, we were talking about it the other day, who's the youngest person in the assembly? I think they were
38.
38. Yeah. So there isn't really any representation of young voices in the assembly, which is something that I understand that you're quite passionate about.
Yeah, well, that is one of the main drivers of why I'm standing. So, yeah, the youngest person in the States is 38, so that leaves well over 20,000 islanders without any direct representation. And if you want evidence for there not being any young voices in the States, you can find it in the fact that we've put the election in the middle of the exam season. So not only are you studying for 10 GCSEs or doing 3 A levels, if you want to be engaged in any way in the election, you then have to go through a 300-page manifesto booklet. So it's completely sort of unfair to younger generations, and it's no surprise really that we have such under engagement in our younger demographics, whether it be through sort of failures on education, the fact that if you want to engage or listen to a states debate, whether it be on cannabis or assisted dying or whatever it may be, you have to listen and tune into this sort of crackly radio broadcast. There's no visual live stream of it at all, which for our generation, which has sort of grown up on YouTube and TikTok and whatnot, it's just not conducive to engagement at all. When I was at school at St Sampson's and then to sixth form, so from 2011 to 2018, there were 211 plus debates. There was a 2-3 school model debate, and deputies really barely engaged with us at all. And we were sort of the most important stakeholders of those decisions at that time. So that's why I've said in my manifesto, look, I want to represent that voice in the States. So I've committed to meeting with the students of our colleges, sixth forms and secondary schools every sort of 2 to 3 months to make sure that voice is always heard by and represented in the States. It sounds really cheesy, but I think if young people feel as though they have a say in the future, I think they're far more likely to stay for the future. And that's what Guernsey desperately needs right now.
I just wanted to ask you about Forward Guernsey and Future Guernsey. Ask you, first of all, can you explain the difference? And then can you tell us why you chose to run with Forward Guernsey, which have adopted the manifesto of Future Guernsey?
Yes, yeah. So I decided to stand with Forward Guernsey because Guernsey has a long tradition of having independent deputies. But unfortunately, what that means is we have 38 individual deputies who all stood on their own manifesto promises, who all are pulling in different directions. And we're expecting for one coherent plan to emerge out of that setup. And sort of term after term, we've shown that not enough gets done, not enough progress gets made. I think that's borne out by the fact that we consistently underinvest in our infrastructure, that we've sort of sleptwalked into an aging demographic crisis, that we've sleptwalked into a housing crisis as well. So we don't have forward and joined up thinking and long-term planning. I think with a party, you can say if we subscribe to these sort of common manifesto goals that we all genuinely believe in and that we can work as a team, there's a much clearer path to build consensus and actually to get things done and deliver in the States through being a team. If I'm on my own, I can promise the world on education, on health, on climate change. but ultimately I'm one voice in a sort of sea of 38 voices. So I have to bring at least 20 people with me every single time I want to get something done. And that is not, I don't think that's an efficient way for our government to work anymore. But Forward Guernsey sort of still respects the tradition of independent deputies as well. So we're only subscribed to voting the same way on our 6 key policy areas. So that's housing, tax, economic growth, education, healthcare, climate change. And so those are the ones we're voting the same way on, but for every issue that falls outside of the manifesto, we'll be voting independently. So there's a nice mix in there, I think, and it's a way of doing party politics that makes a bit more sense for Guernsey. In terms of the difference between Future and Forward Guernsey, if it sounds confusing, that's because it is. There's no two ways about it. Future Guernsey was originally a sort of political movement, a sort of think tank. So they did research, they did community engagement and polling to understand, right, what are Islanders' 6 key priorities? And that's now been reflected in the manifesto. And I think their intention was always, and this is through talking with Gavin, was involved from the start of that process. Their intention was always to form as a political party, but sort of halfway through that process, the states changed the election spending limits. So from a recommended limit of about 15 or 16,000 for parties, and then they slashed it down to £3,000 for a variety of reasons. Basically, when they did that, it essentially made it impossible for Future Guernsey to form as a party. So Gavin, we sort of wanted to still promote this manifesto and have it at the forefront of this election and have eyes drawn to it and have these ideas pushed forward. The only way of doing that was forming a separate organisation, completely separate from Future Guernsey, as a party that could adopt the manifesto, and that ended up being Forward Guernsey.
That cap was brought in that cut the spending limit on campaigns from 15,000 down to 3,000. This is my understanding that this cap was brought in after Future Guernsey had already formed and had spent all of this money and had gotten together the manifesto, or at least the beginnings of the manifesto. Is that right?
Yes. So last election, so if we go back to 2020, parties had a limit of £9,000 to spend, and individuals had a limit of about £6,000. And every individual had an allowance of £500, which it all gets a bit confusing, but that essentially meant that for people who didn't have that much money to put towards a campaign, you could at least have £500, which you could claim back from the states to put towards your own campaign and sort of level the playing field a little bit. When this was debated with the states, it was recommended to the states that parties have a spending limit of £15,000. So that would allow them to properly do what parties do, which is put together manifestos in a proper way, not doing it piecemeal. So to actually have the resources to do this in a conventional way, that's what you would have needed. But the states decided, as I said, for a variety of reasons, to cut the individual allowance to £3,000 and the party allowance to £3,000. A couple of reasons behind that. One was, as you've said, we don't want high net worth individuals to be able to just buy a seat in the states. That's not how democracy should work. But also, some people would say there was probably an effort on some people's part to prevent the conventional forming of parties. So I think people probably saw Future Guernsey coming at that point and wanted to try and restrict that a little bit. And I completely appreciate the perception of we are adopting a manifesto that's been promoted for months. I understand that. But the reality is that Forward and Future Guernsey are genuinely separate organisations. So we don't share personnel, we don't share resources, they don't promote any of our candidates. And they aren't allowed, Future Guernsey, as a political movement, can't endorse or promote any election candidates themselves. So all they do is promote the manifesto that they've made. And we've adopted that manifesto. But actually, the reason I think it's quite fair among most candidates is because there are other candidates who've publicly endorsed sections of that manifesto as well and adopted it into their own manifesto. So while we've adopted it, any candidate is open to say, if they like the healthcare section, they can take anything from the healthcare section and attribute it to Future Guernsey and use it themselves. It's great for us because we think if we get elected, there's people who may get in that we can work with to deliver these ideas. But really, this confusion emanates out of the fact that we have a legal framework that does not properly accommodate parties. So parties are a pretty uncontroversial feature in almost every democracy in the world. In Guernsey, it's impossible to form them in the normal way because of these spending rules. So we're saying if we get in, let's create a legal mechanism that firstly accommodates parties, so we can properly form them, so we don't have to do this future forward stuff and confuse everyone. Let's be able to form parties in the normal way. But then also let's go further than that. We want to hold ourselves to the highest standards possible. There's really no legislation that holds parties to account in terms of donations or reporting requirements or whatever else. So we're committed to introducing measures that make sure we have to be transparent and accountable. And we want to hold ourselves to the highest standards possible. So we're committed to changing this so that in the future we don't have to confuse everyone.
A lot of people in Guernsey worry about the concept of party politics because we see huge levels of polarization in the US with the Democrats and the Republicans, in the UK with the Tories and Labour. There's a lot of anxiety that party politics in Guernsey would create the same level of polarization that we see in other areas of the world. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's an absolutely valid concern. And it's something I actually shared to Gavin before I sort of approached Forward Guernsey to join, because it was something, one of my concerns that I shared. So at the minute, when people say this, I think sometimes we forget we have an incredibly polarized states of Guernsey already. So many of the important votes are split down the middle this term. It's 50-50. There's very much two sides of the assembly. And there's been a problem of we have put personality politics over policy. So to answer your question, I absolutely share the concern of increasing polarization. But at the minute, when we have 38 individuals, we almost, in a sense, have 38 individual parties anyway, because, every important vote, or most important votes that have happened this term in the States have been divided right down the middle. So whether it be, 21-19 or whatever. And it's, as I said, we've sort of put personality politics over policy. And we've forgotten that we're supposed to work together in the best interests of the people who have elected the deputies. And it's not about personal spats. I've sat in the States chamber and I've seen deputies loudly talking over each other when they're talking. I've read reports of deputies making neck slicing gestures at one another during debates, or getting up and leaving the chamber while certain other colleagues get up to speak. So I've got some policies that I put forward to try and fix some of that, such as visually live streaming states debates, so we can hold that kind of behavior to account. But what I think is that if we have a policy-based party, which is what we are, we're saying, look, here are our ideas, here's the vision for Guernsey that we see. We can hopefully make it so that within the states, our disagreements with other people are about policy rather than personality. And that is exactly what the States is there to do. We have all joined this party because we are by nature collaborators. We want to work with other people. We want to work within a team. We're not a gang of six versus the world. We genuinely want to build consensus and bring people with us. And I think this is an important point, because I feel as though the community, when it comes to things like GST, feel as though these decisions are being made above them rather than with them. And we have been making a real effort to engage with every corner of the community in Guernsey to understand what the concerns are, understand what problems we need to solve, what are islanders' top priorities, and then put that towards the states. I personally, if I'm elected, my attitude will be, if I disagree with the person sitting next to me, if I disagree with them on 99 out of 100 issues, there's that one issue we can work together on, find common ground on, and deliver on in the best interests of people in Guernsey, then that's what I'm going to do. People haven't elected me to have personal disputes. They've elected me to work in their interests. I understand the concern, but actually I think parties can help make more of the conversation about policy rather than personality. I may be proved wrong in that, but I think we have such a divided states right now that it's worth a try taking this new route.
You mentioned earlier about additional earned allowances. That was something in your manifesto that really caught my eye. And while we're talking about making sure that young people stay on island, I think it's really, really pertinent to talk about. Can you tell us a little bit about what the additional earned allowances are, what they mean?
So I'll give you some background as to why I think this policy is so important and it has the potential to make a huge difference in Guernsey, I think. The reason I decided to stand was that I spoke at the launch of the Future Guernsey Manifesto. I'd been invited to give my perspective on it as a young person. And I asked a room of 200 people at the Performing Arts to put their hand up if they knew a young person who's recently left or seriously considering leaving the island. And all 200 people put their hand up. And I thought, well, if we don't solve that problem, it doesn't matter what type of taxes we have if there's no one there to pay them. It doesn't matter how many schools we have if there's no students to fill them. So this is the problem, I think, that we need to solve. And if we don't reverse it, Guernsey will suffer a slow sort of social and economic decline. So what's the number one barrier to keeping young people here? There's lots of barriers, but the number one is the cost of housing. So the average house price is 16 times average income. For most young people, they fall on the wrong end of that average income. So it's more 18, 19 times, 20 times average income. So with the additional earned allowance, we're trying to solve that problem. So we're saying for 16 to 30-year-olds, we're saying that you would pay no income tax on your first £100,000 of your taxable earnings, which very broadly means that young people would be able to save up to £20,000 to go towards either a deposit for a house or an eligible pension scheme. And obviously, most young people are going to put that towards a housing deposit. And so, for example, if you earn 20 grand a year, so over 5 years, that will accumulate to £100,000. You pay no income tax. So by that 5th year, you'll have £20,000 that will be put in a Guernsey property savings account, which will be, so that's a tax-free savings account where you can also put your savings in as well. So I think about me and my girlfriend Chloe. If we'd had this policy in place for the last few years, we're both 25, we've both lived and worked here. If we had this policy in place, by now we'd be 2/3 of the way to buying a house, which, not including any other savings we might have made, as well as the additional earned allowance. So that feels like where we should be, 25, sort of getting there towards buying a house. But without the policy, it's not even in the question. And that's the reality for so many young people I speak to. There are people who are leaving, not out of choice, but because they are literally shut out of the housing market. We're saying, look, we need to reform our tax system so that young people can build capital at the time in their lives when they most need to, so that that choice is open to them. Additional earned allowances will be one of the things that I'll be fighting hardest for if I do get elected.
And it feels really pertinent. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the wealth disparity in Guernsey when we talk about housing in a while, but it feels really pertinent at the moment. I mean, as somebody that has left the island and has no plans as of right now to return, the idea of buying a house for, myself, for my older brother, he's 10 years older than me, the idea of him even buying a house is completely off the table with the current kind of system that we're dealing with. So I think it's really fantastic, and I hope that it's something that you can get through the States.
The reason I sort of have decided to try and champion this in the States as part of Forward Guernsey is because I have a real stake in solving this problem. Because if we don't solve this problem, then I don't know if I'll be able to raise a family here in the long-term future. So, for a lot of the deputies we have, house building, career building, family raising are sort of for a lot of them, that's all in the rearview mirror. And that's not to say they don't work very hard on behalf of Guernsey, but it's a different thing to actually understand and be in the middle of the very problem that you're trying to solve. And that's sort of motivating me quite a lot to try and push these things forward and hopefully be able to get elected.
So you, along with the rest of, I think all of the Forward Guernsey candidates, have signed up to Liberate's 5 Asks, Liberate being the organisation in Guernsey that supports LGBTQ plus rights. Can you tell us a little bit about that and talk us through why you signed up and why that's important to you?
I think as a group, we signed up to the 5 Asks because we believe it's really important for everyone in our small community to feel as though they're valued, they're listened to, they're included. And essentially what we've signed up to with the 5 Asks is to make sure that if there's a policy coming before the States, a policy letter or an issue that's being debated, that we don't do anything without consulting and listening to the LGBTQ plus community first. So, we think that's really important. And it reflects our sort of broader attitude as a party, because it's been one of the joys of this campaign, actually. As a group, we've been trying to engage with all corners of the local community. So we've had drop-in events with our local Africans in Guernsey community. So that's the name they give themselves. We've shared lunch over several weekends with local Kenyans, local Ghanaians, local Nigerians, getting a taste of their cuisine and their culture and sharing an understanding. So giving them an education about what our confusing electoral system is. And we actually get a sense of what their concerns and the issues they face in Guernsey are. We're very much of the mindset that Guernsey is at its best when we enable everyone to feel included and enable everyone to speak up and contribute to the debate, because where, democracy works best when as many people are engaged as possible.
And kind of going on from that, with the last assembly, we had anti-discrimination legislation finally come through.
Finally.
Finally, obviously there were some amendments that aimed to water it down, but luckily none of those passed, and we have this legislation finally. Phase 2 is, if you were elected, will be happening while you are in the States. Can you talk to us about what's coming in phase 2 and how Forward Guernsey candidates will support that?
Yeah, so I should probably make clear, social policy like this is not included within the manifesto itself. So I want to be careful not to speak for my colleagues. But Guernsey only passed its first comprehensive anti-discrimination bit of legislation in, was it October 2023? And I remember when I was doing my legal training, I spoke to barristers who practiced equality law in the UK, and they just could not believe that a leading hub of finance like Guernsey was so far behind the curve on this. They were really staggered by it. So phase 2, to my understanding, will introduce new protected characteristics such as sex, gender reassignment, and age, among a few others. Now, having worked, as I've said before, in some equality law cases in the UK, I know that just because having the law is only the first step. Just because you have the law does not mean it's being observed or implemented properly. So if I'm elected, and I've said this at an event earlier this week, I'm really committed to engaging with businesses, with these protected groups, with stakeholders to understand what their experiences are, and whether the various protections that have been brought in are actually being observed and implemented. Some deputies sort of think that, we've done the law now, so we can sort of let that go. No, it's an ongoing process, and it's all about engaging with those people that it's meant to protect.
I wanted to ask you about this. There have been some criticisms levied against the Future Guernsey Manifesto by me about proposed housing policy not going quite far enough. So there's a lot in the manifesto about building more homes, and although that is a part of addressing the housing crisis, in my opinion, it doesn't address the issue of distribution of wealth, which is an issue stark on this island because there is such a huge wealth disparity. Would Forward Guernsey candidates support policies like rent control, cooperative housing initiatives, which some scholars argue go further in addressing the housing crisis than just building more homes?
It's a really good question. On the sort of wealth disparity, I could not agree with you more. It's why homelessness is such a important part of our housing offering as well. It's why we're sort of saying we need to make housing a statutory right, like places like Finland have, to add some real urgency to this. We're saying we need to work with third sector charities like Caritas, as an example, to sort of help provide real pathways out of homelessness. It's not just about providing emergency housing. That's a sticking plaster. We need to actually be able to make it so people can get back on their feet and back into the community again. We have a housing manifesto offering in the housing section that tries to address this problem in a holistic way. So addressing the homelessness problem, we have a GDP of 3.5 billion. We have billionaires on this island sharing the same 25 square miles as 1,000 people without secure housing. Obviously, that's untenable, it's unsustainable, and we have to do something about that. So that's why we've put that forward. In terms of cooperative housing, I love the idea of cooperative housing. Our manifesto that we have is the first of its kind. It's 43 pages. It's been put together by over 50 local experts and volunteers. So because it's the first of its kind, it's obviously not perfect. It's not got everything that anyone would ever want in there, but it's a start. So, I like the idea of cooperative housing because, I think it fosters a stronger sense of community. I'm really open to the idea, and I like the fact that, people can be shareholders in the cooperative and have a vote and a say over how things are run. So I think that's great. And I think at a time when actually we need to reignite a sense of community, that could very much be part of that picture. The only two issues I have with the idea is that, firstly, I think Guernsey doesn't really have a history of cooperative housing. So I think we need to have community buy-in first to this. So we need to persuade people that it's the right thing. And we need to try and win that argument and sort of not just say, not have it be the state saying, we're going to do cooperative housing now, whether you like it or not, and have it go wrong at some point. And then also we would need a legislative framework to accommodate cooperative housing, which will obviously take time and resources. So I'm, you know, and this is not me saying no to any of this. This is just saying these are the problems we need to solve to get there. Our immediate housing need is to build, and I know we might disagree on this, we need to build more homes. And essentially that's what we're trying to do. And I don't think cooperative housing addresses that in the short term. Medium to long term, we're absolutely open to the idea. And maybe I hope in a few years' time, we'll be able to have this conversation again and say, we're doing this on cooperative housing. But obviously not within the manifesto yet. I don't see a problem with sort of rent controls. So saying, here's the market value, you're only allowed to increase it by a few percentage points, you know, or align with inflation or whatever. My only worry with rent caps is that if landlords don't have the return to be able to pay off the mortgage on that property, then they're more unlikely to rent out that property. And that will only be to the detriment of tenants in the long term. So I'm absolutely open to the idea. I just want us to consider these ideas in a way that will hopefully protect tenants as well.
A line in the manifesto that said, Future Guernsey supports fair, appropriate and proportionate rights for both renters and landlords. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we obviously know, and you know, as I said, I've been a renter since I was 18. We know that the relationship between landlords and tenants is there's a baked-in imbalance there, because you know the landlord owns property, the tenant doesn't generally. And so and as a county court advocate, I practiced in landlord and tenant law. Currently, Guernsey is a sort of regulatory Wild West when it comes to the rental market. You know, there are, to my knowledge, no legal minimum notice periods set by law. There are no minimum property standards, deposit protection scheme that gives that protection to tenants. So, but you have to balance that against the fact that to have an affordable rental market, you also need a sufficient supply. And to have a reliable supply, you need to be able to have landlords feel as though they're able to rent out their properties. Having practiced in this exact area of law in the UK, I have seen tenants benefit from having protections about minimum property standards, but I've also seen landlords benefit from being able to get their property back from someone who just hasn't taken care of that property at all. And when both sides have that protection and that security, that's going to mean that tenants have more security in their residence and landlords have more security in their investment.
So in the Future Guernsey manifesto, which of course yourself and the other Forward Guernsey candidates are adopting, that you don't support GST Plus in its current form. Can you tell me what that means and whether or not you and the other Forward Guernsey candidates support an increase in corporation tax or the introduction of inheritance tax, capital gains tax or withholding tax?
It's a really good question. So we have a 6-step tax plan, which anyone could go and read on the manifesto, but the headline is we're essentially saying that we need to, before we look at implementing a consumption tax, which is, as I'm sure you'll know, it's regressive, you know, it takes up a larger proportion of lower income households' income than it would for wealthy individuals. We need to look at more fairly balancing the burden of taxation between businesses, between high net worth individuals and between individual islanders. So without boring you with the whole 6 steps, a couple of things that we want to do to achieve that is raising corporation tax, which you're saying, so moving from 0.10 to 0.15. So the sort of financial services businesses that are caught by that tax regime will be paying more. Closing tax loopholes for high net worth individuals. So at the minute we have, you know, there are individuals who come here because there's no inheritance tax, because there's no wealth tax, and then they go to their wealth advisor and their wealth advisor says, well, do you know about personal investment holding companies? And without going into too much detail, there's sort of a way of deferring your income so you don't have to pay tax on it. So that's potentially quite a lot of revenue that's just falling through the bucket. And Jersey has already closed these loopholes. So these are sort of relatively simple steps we can take to raise revenue from sources other than, you know, the individual sort of average taxpayer. Another step we're looking at is fixing tax administration. So most islanders are several years behind on their tax returns. So we're saying, how can government actually know what revenue it needs to raise if everyone's so far behind on their tax returns and hasn't had their assessments? So that's the way we're trying to reform the tax system so it's a little bit fairer. Once we've done all that, we will then see, okay, what revenue's been raised by this? What fiscal position are we in? and then see, do we still need a GST? Do we still need a consumption tax? So we're not saying, we don't want to lie to people. We're not absolutely ruling it out, but we're saying let's take the steps that give us the best possible chance of not having to implement a consumption tax. Because if we take all those steps first, I think we're more likely to bring people with us and earn people's trust. Hopefully communicate to people why we might need a consumption tax in the end. But again, we've got to take those steps first. When it comes to those other taxes you mentioned, sort of inheritance and capital gains, I'm no tax expert, I'll say this, but my understanding is that they could impact Guernsey's competitiveness. And obviously, if that happens in a substantial way, being a small island, that will have a serious knock-on effect on our ability to fund our state schools, to make sure our hospitals have the capacity to look after our most vulnerable. So I think the risk presented by those taxes are sort of reflected in the fact that there are no, or at least I'm not aware of any candidates who are putting them forward in their manifesto in this election. But I would balance that by saying, if I can be presented with a study or evidence or an argument which makes a case, a solid case that Guernsey could survive with such taxes, then I'm open to it. But at the minute, with what I understand and the people in these industries I've interacted with, I'm not sure that's feasible right now. Part of our tax reform is increasing corporate tax, is clamping down on loopholes on high net worth individuals.
The next thing I'm going to ask you about is violence against women and girls. Violence against women and girls in the Channel Islands made headlines in 2023 when Jersey published a really detailed report that said that 27% of the island's population had experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetimes. It's a huge issue worldwide at the moment, with manosphere content from the likes of Andrew Tate skyrocketing and becoming really, really popular. Calls have been made by various local charities and organisations, including mine, Guernsey Women's Collective, to replicate this report in Guernsey so that Guernsey can have some reliable statistical information on how big of an issue this really is. A mention of this was made in the Future Guernsey Manifesto, which I really loved, because I haven't actually read that in any other manifesto that I saw, and I've read all of them now because I've voted and have done all of that. So I didn't see a mention in any other manifesto that I can remember. So can you tell me a little bit more about why this is an important issue to you? And yeah, can you just tell us a little bit more about the Forward Guernsey plan when it comes to violence against women and girls?
Of course. So this is something that Guernsey is so far behind on. When you're a guy, it's quite easy to sort of turn a blind eye to some of the things that go on, particularly in the nighttime economy. You know, I remember with my girlfriend Chloe of 8 years, but I remember in the early days, it was a shock to realize that sort of the reality for you as a man on a night out was not the same reality for a woman on a night out. So because of that experience, I've engaged with various charities, you know, like Safety Net, for example, to understand, you know, what can deputies do to make sure the nighttime economy in Guernsey is safer, and what can we do to sort of address, as you said, the problem of violence against women and girls. So as you said, we've committed in our manifesto to establish a violence against women and girls task force, as they've done in Jersey. So follow that direction. So that we can gather data and understand where Guernsey sits within this problem. And so once we have that data, we'll be able to help shape evidence-based government policy to put it before the states. Because at the minute, if you come to the states and you say, this is a problem, let's do this, deputies will, and some of them have said, well, I don't think it's a problem, and you've got no data to back it up. So establishing a task force solves that problem. And I know there's people in Jersey who've been a part of that task force who are happy to lend their expertise and help in helping Guernsey follow that route. So that's what Forward Guernsey are putting forward. Personally as well, I think there's a number of other steps that we can take. So, but this is not within the Forward Guernsey manifesto. So making CCTV mandatory in pubs, clubs and bars, so that we can help prevent and where necessary prosecute cases of spiking, sexual assault, sexual harassment. So it needs to be a condition as part of your liquor license to have CCTV, because as you know, as Daisy, as you'll know, and as I'm sure there's lots of other people out there who will know, one of the biggest barriers to a successful prosecution is evidence, and CCTV invariably plays a very important part in that. That's number two. Number three as well, again, not within the main manifesto, but as we said, passing phase 2 of the anti-discrimination law, so that we introduce sex as a protected characteristic. So that will offer protections in employment, in the access of goods and services. And again, that is just a basic measure, and we need to sort of catch up. These are not controversial things, but they are a foundation from which we can build off. So those are the three priorities. And as I said, I'm very open to listening, engaging with all the sort of charities that concern themselves with this area specifically.
Carbon capture, so just for anyone that doesn't know, carbon capture removes carbon dioxide from highly concentrated point sources like power plants. But climate activists have warned that even with decades of research, carbon capture technology not only removes only a few seconds worth of our yearly greenhouse gas emissions, but it also costs thousands of pounds for every ton of CO2 that's removed and consumes excessive amounts of energy. This was something that was mentioned in the Future Guernsey manifesto under climate. I was wondering if, considering the allegations about climate capture being greenwashing, I was wondering what your response to that was, and if Future Guernsey supports deploying other renewable energy sources.
No, it's a really good question, and obviously, again, I appreciate the concerns about carbon capture being used as a way for companies to essentially, whether it be justifying sort of oil expansion or prolonging the use of fossil fuels and delaying the transition. I completely get the concerns with all of that, which is why we're treating carbon capture as just one tool within the toolbox. We're not staking the house on it. And carbon capture, it sort of moves us close to carbon neutrality, but not net zero. And we've committed to both. Being committed to both, we have committed to a much wider or broader set of proposals. So we've said we want to accelerate progress on the wind farm project. So the wind farm will obviously bring in a new source of renewable energy for Guernsey. But beyond that, it won't just sort of help move us closer to net zero. It'll bring new employment opportunities. It will give us energy independence in a very, very volatile market. It will, as I said, move us closer to net zero and bring in sort of extra revenues, because if the figures that we have now are to be believed, it will allow us to, with the energy generated by the wind farm, hopefully export surplus energy that we don't need to French or UK markets. That raises enough revenue, then we can hopefully remove some of the tax burdens on individual islanders and make it a little bit easier for people, within such a difficult cost of living context. Along with that, investing in green skills. So again, whether that be people who we have to train to work on the wind farm or whatever it is. I also work for the Guernsey Development Agency, are sort of in charge of creating plans for the redevelopment of the East Coast. And we're trying quite hard to interweave green projects within our development. So creating new green spaces in housing developments, so creating biodiverse areas that weren't previously there, encouraging active travel with new cycle paths, having transport hubs in St Sampson's and St Peter Port with hopefully electric buses that can sort of shuttle back and forth. So along with sea defences as well, because obviously climate mitigation is part of the climate strategy. So again, we're thinking very broadly about it. We've got big ambitions. Carbon capture, completely share your concern. We think it plays a role, but it's absolutely not we're staking the house on, but it plays a sort of smaller role in a wider picture.
So moving on from climate, there are growing concerns over complicity in war crimes currently being committed by Israel in Palestine. Some local groups, Guernsey Friends for Palestine, are asking potential candidates to promise divestment from BlackRock, which is a company that Guernsey heavily invests in, which is blacklisted by the UN as potentially complicit in the atrocities being committed by Israel in Palestine. Does Forward Guernsey pledge to divest? I know that you have already responded directly to Guernsey Friends of Palestine, and I was wondering if you could talk me through that response and let the viewer know where you stand.
It's a great question. Even though it's not something that it's not an area that falls within our manifesto, we wanted to respond as a group because we acknowledge how important an issue this is. So we absolutely can share the concerns of the campaign group. We want to make sure that Guernsey is first and foremost investing ethically, that it is prioritizing and observing ESG. It's all too easy for us in Guernsey, in a very sort of safe and sheltered environment, to turn a blind eye to what goes on thousands of miles away from us, and for us to understand, well, how does anything we do here facilitate or impact what happens in Gaza or the West Bank? So as I said before, we think it's important to tackle, if we're going to tackle this problem, let's do it properly. So, as we mentioned in our response, the States also has investments in other investment funds that have been named by the UN as potentially facilitating the trading of arms and risking complicity in what's going on in the Middle East. So, investment funds such as Morgan Stanley and State Street. So that's why we've committed as a group to Guernsey Friends of Palestine to meet with the campaign group to better understand what their objectives are and how can we craft a policy around that. So let's take this opportunity. Yourselves as a group have done a great job of raising this issue. So let's see how we can tackle the entire problem and beyond BlackRock. We're absolutely committed to meeting and understand how we can deliver that.
Tom, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's been lovely talking to you and getting to know you. And is there anything else that you would like to say before June 18th?
Thank you very much for having me, Daisy. I really appreciate the time and really enjoy the conversation. I just want to say I appreciate the work you do in making information about this election more accessible to young people. And all I would say to the people who've made it this far, whether it's for me or whoever you vote for, just make sure you get out and vote and make sure you make your voice heard if you are registered, because if young people don't make their voices heard in this election, I think we'll be here in the exact same place in 4 years complaining about some of the same issues. So I think we have to break that cycle. Please do get involved. And if anyone has any questions, I am Tom Rylatt on Facebook, on Instagram, tomrylatt2025.com as well if you want to find out more about my policies. So please do get in touch if you'd like.